I showed the open fermenters. Most of our beers are fermented in closed fermenters. There are some advantages. These are what are called conical fermenters. They got a steam cone bottom. At the end of fermentation, the yeast settles out. You can take the yeast out from under the beer rather than with the open fermenters. You're either going to pump the beer off of the yeast or skim the yeast off the surface. And we also can capture the carbon dioxide from the fermentation process with these tanks. They're all the way closed. And nobody needs to jump into them and clean them, which is the open fermenter. Somebody actually climbs in them and scrubs them every batch. So a lot less labor. But this is what I started out with, 6 closed tanks. I had these built down in Yuba City. I actually had them rolled up. I did all the welding myself. And they're very primitive. They couldn't hold pressure. They were actually like glorified spring tanks. Yuba City's steel was not building sanitary food processing equipment per se. They were a stainless fabricator. We did that work. But I welded them up with my skills I learned at Butte College and polished them. And this is what we started with, 6 of those things. My original bottling line went 60 bottles a minute. It was an old soft drink filler I bought up in Washington State at a defunct soft drink plant. Not a great beer filler, but it got us started. We soon found an old filler that the Anchor Steam Brewery was casting off, and we upgraded a year or so after that. My original labor, it was a death machine. It would throw about every 20th bottle at you. At the end of a bottling year, there'd be a mound of glass next to the machine. We started out with long neck beer bottles. These are cases of Schlitz and Budweiser. I was buying bottles from other breweries when they had them available. And we did this for a year or so until we couldn't find any bottles. It turned out there was a shortage. And so we immediately had to shift into a bottle very similar to what we're using today. I like to show this shot. This was our original beer warehouse, which was about the size of this stage, maybe. And we would age all of our bottle conditioned beers, all of our beers were bottle conditioned. They were continuing to ferment in the bottle for another 2 weeks after we packaged them. And they would build up pressure. And the bottles we were buying, actually I bought a lot of bottles when we first started from the Meyer Brewing Company in Los Angeles, the Brew 102 brewery, for those of you who might have seen or known that. They had gone out of business and they had a warehouse full of empty bottles, and I bought a couple of truckloads figuring that would be enough forever. I'd charge a nickel a bottle, and of course I'd get them all back. After a few months we were out of bottles, we sent them out, and people didn't return them very quickly. But those bottles, a lot of them now probably are worth $10, $20, $50 a bottle. They were these bottles from the 30s and 40s with magnificent labels on them. If I had kept them rather than washing all the labels off, it probably would have financed my new brewery. I show this shot because this was our original warehouse. I'd never envisioned owning a forklift, so this door was like this wide and couldn't drive a forklift through the door. I only thought of delivering a hand truck of beer at the time. It didn't take us too long to outgrow that. Draft beer, we actually didn't start out with any draft beer. This racker, by the way, is what you see up front. This is what we used our first few years. Started out in bottle beer only, and back in the early 80s, draft beer was sold by most breweries as a loss leader. You could buy a keg of a lot of draft beer for $20 or $22, and there was no way it would pencil out for a small brewer to try to compete in that arena. And there weren't any of these draft-centric pubs like we have now, where they're selling a lot of beers. It was typically 1 or 2 lager beers, and maybe one import Guinness if it was an Irish bar or something else, but they didn't have 6 tap handles for craft beers. So we didn't do any draft beer for the first couple of years, and we just did bottles. But at some point in the early 80s, mid-80s, there started to be a focus on doing draft. This shop, we didn't do any filtering our first few years. This was our first filter. We were pretty excited about it. This came from Anchor as well as they expanded. We couldn't afford to filter in the early days, and we had a lot of yeast. Any of you who were around in 1981 and saw our beer, sometimes there'd be a ½ inch of yeast in the bottle, and sometimes there'd be an 1/8 of an inch. So we didn't have a good way to control that, so we eventually started filtering the yeast out and actually adding back yeast. So our beers are still contain live yeast. Not all of our brands, but our Pale Ale and our Porter and Stout and Celebration and Bigfoot still have live yeast in the bottle, but a very controlled amount now. So we've really perfected that aspect. We're probably the largest bottle-conditioned brewery in the world now. Cooper's in Australia is about our size, and there's a couple others in Europe that are close to our size. But one of the largest, if not the largest. This was the second bottling line, so this came from the Anchor Brewery. This was a huge upgrade for us. And the story behind this bottling line actually came out of Al Capone's brewery, the Stevens Brewery in Chicago. So it had a great history, we thought, and went from Al Capone's brewery to Anchor, and then we bought it. So it was a huge step up for us, but it was still like a 1950s vintage filler. Al Capone wasn't running it at that point, but I'm going to skip through that one. That one doesn't have much to do today. But so this article came out in the San Francisco Examiner magazine in 1983, and it was really a huge shot in our arm. It was in the Sunday magazine section, the Image magazine. They still have something like that today. And we got just huge notoriety, and right about that time we had a Chico State student whose dad was the beer buyer for one of the largest grocery chains in California. And he'd come and visit his daughter and stop by our little brewery, and he was enamored with what we were doing. So he started advertising our beer, discounting it in circulars and all that in the store throughout the whole state. And so we had all this free publicity. This article came out, and we were immediately completely sold out. We just could not make